In 1999, the European company behind the best-selling amplifier in audio history quietly braced for financial collapse. The NAD 3020, an integrated amplifier that moved over 1 million units, had once defined high fidelity. But by the late 90s, the market had shifted. Hi-fi dealers across Canada were clearing out stereo gear to make way for home theater processors. The listeners who once built their basement rec rooms around that minimalist gray box were trading honest power for multi-channel chips. The 3020 was effectively obsolete, a mechanical artifact drowning in a digital wave. A decade earlier, the NAD badge had meant absolute engineering trust. Now, it was a distressed asset. The paradox is that this global icon was not saved by its original designers. It was saved by Lenbrook, a Canadian distribution group in Pickering, Ontario that bought the entire company to keep the philosophy of the honest watt alive. But to understand why a Canadian firm bought a foreign audio empire, one must return to 1978, to the moment that cheap gray box first challenged the North American listening room. Every week, we document the forgotten Canadian audio brands, amplifiers, speaker labs, and listening rooms that once defined how people experience music, and what happened when the global market changed around them. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with a corporate acquisition, but with a structural vacuum in the stereo shops of the late 1970s. In 1978, the North American audio market was gripped by a numbers war. Across Canadian stereo shops and hi-fi dealer rooms, the shelves were dominated by Japanese receivers, amplifiers with radio tuners and source controls built into the same unit. These machines were heavy, housed in gleaming silver faceplates and covered in toggle switches, equalizer sliders, and glowing display meters. The marketing of the late 70s focused almost entirely on continuous power output, measured on a test bench using a static electrical resistor. A buyer walking into a Toronto music store or a Vancouver hi-fi shop would judge an amplifier by its wattage claim and the thickness of its brushed aluminum faceplate. But there was a profound absence in the Canadian market. What listeners actually needed for dynamic music was high current delivery, the ability of an amplifier to supply brief, massive surges of electrical power when the music demanded it, especially when driving the complex crossover networks of real loudspeakers. Instead, buyers were taking home impressive-looking boxes with weak internal power supplies that choked the moment a kick drum hit hard or a bass line dropped. In Pickering, Ontario, a Canadian distribution company named Lenbrook was studying this exact retail gap. Lenbrook was not a manufacturer at the time. They were a vital conduit connecting global audio brands to domestic hi-fi dealers. They understood the psychology of the Canadian listening room, and they knew that local buyers were paying a premium for aesthetic features rather than acoustic performance. Lenbrook sought an alternative, a machine that stripped away the aluminum, the lights, and the unnecessary switches to fund a fundamentally better circuit board. They placed their trust in a relatively unknown brand called New Acoustic Dimension, or NAD. The engineering was led by Björn Erik Edvardsen, a European designer who shared a radical philosophy: put the money on the inside. To make the product affordable for the entry-level market, the manufacturing was outsourced to Taiwan, an unusual and heavily stigmatized move in a late 70s market where domestic or Japanese production was considered the baseline for quality. The result of this collaboration was the NAD 3020. It was an integrated amplifier, a preamp that selects sources, and a power amp that drives the speakers, combined in one chassis that defied every retail trend of 1978. It had a dull, dark gray plastic faceplate. It had no flashing lights, no heavy metal toggles, and no rack mount handles. It featured a simple, asymmetrical layout of plastic knobs. And most concerning for a retail market obsessed with raw power figures, it was rated at a meager 20 watts per channel. To the naked eye, the 3020 looked like a budget afterthought. It looked like a product that belonged on a discount department store shelf, not at the center of a serious basement rec room. But hidden inside that drab casing was a power supply, the heavy transformer and capacitors that provide the electrical muscle that had no business being in a cheap amplifier. Edvardsen had designed a circuit that could deliver enormous short-term current into difficult speaker loads, completely ignoring the conventional pursuit of continuous paper watts. The problem was how to prove it. A spec sheet could not convey high current. A magazine advertisement could not demonstrate dynamic power. To solve this, Lenbrook had to bypass the traditional marketing machinery. They understood that if the NAD 3020 sat quietly on a retail shelf next to a glowing Japanese receiver, it would be entirely ignored. The Canadian distribution strategy relied exclusively on the hi-fi dealer network. Specialized audio showrooms, often with wood-paneled listening rooms and thick carpets, where trusted local salespeople had the autonomy to force a physical demonstration. In 1978, a Lenbrook representative would walk into an independent stereo shop in Ontario or Quebec, unbox the unassuming gray amplifier, and make a highly specific request. They asked the dealer to wire the 20-watt amplifier not to a pair of cheap, entry-level bookshelf speakers, but to the most difficult, power-hungry floor-standing speakers in the store. The skepticism on the showroom floor was universal. In the late 70s, a speaker's impedance, the electrical load or resistance it presents to an amplifier, could swing wildly depending on the frequency of the music being played. When impedance dropped, the speaker demanded vastly more current from the amplifier. Most budget receivers would overheat, heavily distort, or instantly blow a protective fuse when faced with these demanding loads. But when the dealer dropped the needle on a turntable and turned the cheap plastic volume knob, the 3020 did not collapse. It did not distort. Instead, it gripped the massive woofers with absolute authority. It delivered the physical impact of a kick drum and the deep resonance of a bass guitar with a level of control that dealers normally associated with heavy, separate power amplifiers costing 5 times as much. Priced at just under $200, the NAD 3020 shattered the traditional retail economics of the Canadian stereo market. For years, audio magazines and catalogs had advised buyers to split their budget evenly between the amplifier and the speakers. Suddenly, a listener outfitting a Toronto apartment or a basement rec room could spend a fraction of their budget on the amplifier, allowing them to invest heavily in premium, laboratory-measured loudspeakers. The initial reception rippled through the Canadian audio community before it ever became a global phenomenon. Dealers realized they could sell a complete high-performance hi-fi system to a university student or a young professional who previously could only afford a basic all-in-one record player. The gray box was an amplifier that demanded to be heard rather than seen. Yet the secret to this impossible performance was not magic, nor was it a simple accounting trick. It was a highly specific, unconventional approach to electronic design that the rest of the industry had largely ignored. This engineered minimalism was difficult to sell on a catalog page, meaning its survival would depend entirely on what happened when a dealer actually wired it to a speaker, revealing the radical circuitry hidden inside. The secret to the NAD 3020 was an engineering philosophy that completely inverted how a budget amplifier was supposed to be built. While competitors were spending heavily on brushed aluminum fascias, intricate LED power meters, and heavy metal toggle switches, Björn Erik Edvardsen stripped the exterior down to the absolute minimum. The faceplate was injection-molded plastic. The volume dial felt slightly hollow. The buttons were simple push switches. But inside that dark gray chassis lay a power supply that belonged in a machine costing 3 times as much. The core of this breakthrough was a concept called dynamic headroom, the ability of an amplifier to briefly produce significantly more power than its continuous rating to handle sudden musical peaks, like the strike of a snare drum or the swell of an orchestra. In the late 70s, a standard Japanese receiver rated at 20 watts might briefly output 22 watts before aggressively distorting. The NAD 3020 rated at a highly conservative 20 watts per channel, possessed a staggering 3 decibels of dynamic headroom. In practical terms, this meant that when a dynamic peak occurred in the music, the 3020 could momentarily deliver 40 or even 80 watts of clean power. For a listener sitting in a Toronto basement rec room, this was the difference between a kick drum sounding like a dull thud against cardboard and a kick drum physically moving the air in the room. Edvardson understood that real music is not a continuous, static test tone. Real music is dynamic and unpredictable. He also understood that real-world loudspeakers are highly reactive electrical loads. To handle this, he designed a high-current output stage. When a speaker's impedance, the electrical load or resistance it presents to the amplifier, dropped dramatically during complex musical passages, conventional budget amplifiers would run out of current, causing the sound to become harsh and brittle, or triggering the amplifier's internal protection circuits to shut the system down completely. The 3020 simply ignored these difficult loads. Its robust power transformer and carefully specified output transistors allowed it to push massive amounts of current into 2 ohm or even 1 ohm loads without failing. It drove large, difficult woofers, the large drivers designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass and drums, with an iron grip that left Canadian hi-fi dealers genuinely bewildered during early showroom demonstrations. But raw power delivery was only part of the equation. The amplifier also featured a proprietary circuit known as soft clipping. When an amplifier is pushed past its maximum output, it typically clips the audio waveform, shearing off the rounded peaks of the sound wave and turning it into a harsh, squared-off shape. This severe distortion generates massive amounts of high-frequency energy that will quickly burn out a tweeter. The small driver designed to reproduce high frequencies such as cymbals, strings, and vocal detail. Edvardson's soft clipping circuit was a switchable feature on the back panel that gently rounded off the waveform when the amplifier was pushed to its absolute limit, mimicking the graceful overload characteristics of vintage vacuum tube amplifiers. This meant that a university student in Kingston could push the 3020 to maximum volume at a house party, and instead of instantly destroying their expensive stereo speakers with harsh clipping, the amplifier would merely compress the sound slightly. It was a safety net that made the little gray box virtually indestructible in real-world use. Furthermore, the engineering brilliance extended to the source itself. In 1978, the primary high-fidelity source was not a digital file or a compact disc. It was the vinyl record. Therefore, the most critical section of any preamplifier was its phono stage, the specialized circuit that takes the microscopic, fragile signal from a turntable cartridge and boosts it, applying the necessary equalization so the main amplifier can process it. Most budget receivers treated the phono stage as an afterthought, using cheap, noisy integrated circuits that masked musical detail behind a veil of electronic hiss. The NAD 3020, however, utilized a discrete phono stage built with high-quality individual components. It was astonishingly quiet and highly resolving. When a listener dropped a needle onto a record in a Montreal listening room, the background was remarkably silent, allowing the stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from specific places between and around the two speakers, to emerge with startling clarity. Reviewers noted that the phono stage alone was worth the entire $200 asking price. This combination of high current, dynamic headroom, soft clipping, and a premium phono stage created a perfect storm for the Canadian audio market. At the exact time the 3020 was entering the market, a revolution was happening in Ottawa at the National Research Council. The NRC Loudspeaker Lab was teaching Canadian brands how to build highly accurate flat measuring speakers. But these new, scientifically designed Canadian speakers often utilized complex crossovers, the electrical networks inside a speaker that send bass to the woofer and treble to the tweeter. These complex crossovers, made the speakers notoriously difficult to drive. Suddenly, Lenbrook had the ultimate solution. A Canadian hi-fi dealer could sell a customer a pair of highly accurate, low-impedance Canadian speakers and confidently pair them with the budget-priced NAD 3020. The gray amplifier provided the exact type of honest, high-current power that the NRC-style speakers demanded. The amplifier validated the speakers, and the speakers revealed the brilliance of the amplifier. It was a symbiotic relationship that elevated the entire baseline of high fidelity in North America. Consumers were no longer forced to choose between a cheap, bad-sounding system and an impossibly expensive luxury setup. The 3020 proved that world-class sound could be achieved on a strict budget, provided the budget was spent on the internal circuit board rather than the external casing. The engineering parameters had rewritten the rulebook, triggering a commercial explosion that forced the Canadian distribution network to its absolute limits. The breakthrough in the demonstration room translated into an unprecedented retail phenomenon. By the early 1980s, the visual landscape of the Canadian hi-fi dealer was physically transforming. Walk into a premier audio showroom like Babelor Radio in downtown Toronto during this era, and a striking contrast was evident. Entire walls were still dedicated to massive Japanese receivers, heavy electronic devices, combining an amplifier and a radio tuner, glowing with blue and green lights. But sitting quietly on the lower shelves, often wired to the most expensive loudspeakers in the room, was the dark gray NAD 3020. Dealers had quickly realized that the 3020 was not just a budget amplifier. It was a foundational building block for a new kind of Canadian stereo system. Because the integrated amplifier, the preamp and power amp combined in one chassis, was so inexpensive, customers suddenly had capital freed up to invest heavily in better transducers. In Montreal listening rooms and Vancouver stereo shops, salespeople began selling a highly specific package. They paired the 3020 with a pair of highly accurate Canadian bookshelf speakers born from the National Research Council's testing culture and a modest belt drive turntable, a rotating platform that plays vinyl records using a rubber belt to isolate motor vibration. This combination became the definitive entry-level high-fidelity system for an entire generation. It was the system installed in university dormitories in Kingston. It was the stereo driving the basement rec room in Halifax. It was the first serious audio purchase for a young professional outfitting a Calgary apartment. The dull plastic volume knob of the 3020 became the literal touch point for how hundreds of thousands of Canadians interacted with their music. At the Lenbrook distribution warehouse in Pickering, Ontario, the logistical challenge shifted from convincing dealers to stock the amplifier to simply keeping the pallets full. The factory in Taiwan was scaling up production to a staggering degree. The 3020 was no longer a niche audiophile secret. It was becoming a mass-market appliance. When a customer looked at a catalog page, a standard receiver promised 50 watts per channel. The NAD promised 20. But when the volume was pushed in a real room, the receiver's sound would compress and harden, while the 3020 kept expanding into the dynamic peaks. The physical proof on the sales floor was dismantling decades of wattage-based marketing. The stakes were monumental. What was being proven in these Canadian dealer rooms was not merely the success of one specific brand, but the validation of an entire philosophy of listening. The NAD 3020 was proving that the North American market would actually pay for invisible engineering if the audible results were undeniable. As production numbers climbed past the hundreds of thousands, the little gray amplifier forced a reckoning across the global audio industry. Competitors scrambled to reverse engineer the high current power supply. Major electronics giants suddenly began releasing their own minimalist amplifiers in a desperate attempt to capture the newly created market segment. The volume of sales created a unique ecosystem, a culture of ownership developed around the gray box. In repair shops across Ontario and Quebec, technicians noted how cleanly the internal circuit boards were laid out. The amplifier was designed to be serviced, not thrown away. If a capacitor, an electronic component that stores electrical energy for the power supply, failed, it could be quickly replaced on a repair bench. The 3020 had ceased to be a mere product. It was now a benchmark. But the sheer scale of its global success was placing immense pressure on the very system that had built it. The scale of this retail phenomenon quickly outpaced any traditional distribution model. At Lenbrook's facility in Pickering, Ontario, the logistics of receiving and shipping the NAD 3020 transformed the company's operations. This was no longer about placing a few boutique units in high-end listening rooms. The dark gray integrated amplifier, a component containing both the control preamp and the power amp in a single chassis, was selling in numbers that the high-fidelity industry had never previously recorded. By the early 1980s, the global audio press had completely surrendered to the 3020. Reviewers who typically evaluated luxury equipment costing thousands of dollars were forced to admit that a plastic-fronted box, assembled in Taiwan and rated at a mere 20 watts, was audibly outperforming established premium electronics. But it was in the Canadian retail environment that the amplifier truly entrenched itself as a cultural default. This immense demand created an inverse problem for stereo retailers. At a music store in Ottawa or a hi-fi dealer in Montreal, the primary challenge was no longer convincing the customer to buy the 3020. The challenge was keeping a demonstration model on the shelf. The Taiwanese factory was producing tens of thousands of units a month, yet Canadian back orders sometimes stretched for weeks. A $200 budget amplifier was suddenly being waitlisted like a rare, exotic sports car. This scarcity only fueled the legend. The sheer volume of sales fundamentally shifted who was participating in high-fidelity audio. Previously, a serious stereo system was a luxury pursuit, requiring a significant percentage of a household's income. The 3020 democratized the critical listening experience. It became the default electronic heart of the Canadian basement rec room. It was packed into car trunks and driven to summer cottages in Muskoka. It was the system that parents handed down to children, heading off to university campuses in Halifax or Edmonton. Because the amplifier was so ruthlessly efficient at driving difficult speaker loads, it acted as a massive economic accelerant for the domestic Canadian loudspeaker industry. When a buyer saved hundreds of dollars on their amplifier, they consistently reinvested that capital into better, laboratory-tested transducers. The 3020 became the unspoken engine for brands like PSB, Energy, and Paradigm. A customer could walk out of a dealer with a complete, NRC-validated stereo system that challenged the finest listening rooms in the world, all for the price of a mid-tier television set. The NAD badge, initially viewed as a symbol of budget compromise, became a mark of engineering intelligence. The brand would eventually move over 1 million units of the 3020 and its direct successors, making it the best-selling hi-fi amplifier in history. It meant that in neighborhoods across Vancouver, Winnipeg, and Toronto, multiple houses on the same street were likely powering their living rooms with the exact same gray box. But managing this unprecedented scale introduced severe systemic pressure. The original through-hole circuit boards, where electronic components have wire leads that are physically inserted through holes in the board and soldered, required meticulous quality control to ensure the high-current power supply remained stable across millions of mass-produced units. The company was pushing the absolute limits of its manufacturing partnerships to meet global demand. Furthermore, the problem with manufacturing the most successful amplifier in audio history is that a company becomes entirely defined by a single miracle. The brand's identity, and Lenbrook's distribution empire alongside it, was now inextricably tethered to a two-channel, analog stereo experience. They had completely mastered the art of playing a vinyl record or a compact disc through a pair of traditional left and right speakers, For over a decade, this mastery was enough. The unassuming gray box ruled the Canadian living room, proving that listeners would reward pure acoustic performance over flashing lights and hollow wattage claims. Yet the very stability of this stereo icon was tied to a domestic entertainment culture that was about to be rewired by screens and surround processors. The first crack in the empire did not appear on a financial spreadsheet or in a factory defect report. It appeared quietly, in the late 1980s, inside the typical Canadian living room. For a decade, the stereo system had occupied the central altar of domestic entertainment. The turntable, the compact disc player, the pair of carefully placed bookshelf speakers, and the dark gray NAD 3020 amplifier formed an undisputed hierarchy. But slowly the physical geography of the room began to shift. The television set, once a modest wooden box pushed into a corner, grew larger and moved to the center of the wall. A videocassette recorder appeared beneath it. In Toronto showrooms and Vancouver dealer rooms, a subtle but permanent change occurred on the sales floor. A dealer who had confidently sold thousands of NAD integrated amplifiers over the years suddenly noticed customers looking past the two-channel audio racks. They were asking for something different. They wanted to recreate the cinema experience at home. The technological shift was profound. The arrival of surround sound formats like Dolby Pro Logic demanded a fundamental rewiring of how audio was processed. A listener no longer needed an amplifier that could simply drive a left and a right speaker with absolute honesty. They needed an AV receiver, a complex audio-video control unit that decodes surround formats, manages video switching, and powers up to 5 separate speakers simultaneously. The NAD 3020 was a pure, mechanical machine built for a strictly analog era. It had no video inputs, it had no digital signal processing, it had no center channel output. Inherently, it could not adapt to this new ecosystem. The market was demanding multi-channel convenience, and massive global electronics corporations were perfectly positioned to supply it. Japanese giants possessed immense research and development budgets. They owned the silicon fabrication plants required to build complex digital processing chips. They could produce massive black plastic AV receivers that boasted 100 watts across 5 channels, complete with complex remote controls and glowing digital displays, all at a highly competitive retail price. For the Canadian hi-fi dealer, the conversation with the buyer fundamentally changed. Selling the 3020 had always been about sitting the customer down, wiring up a difficult pair of Canadian loudspeakers, and proving the superiority of a high-current power supply. It was a demonstration of physical air movement. But in the mid-1990s, the customer walking into a stereo shop was holding a movie rental, not a vinyl record. When a buyer looked at the minimalist gray box and asked, "Where do I plug in the center channel?" the dealer had no answer. The honest Watt, no matter how capable, could not decode a helicopter flying from the front left to the rear right of a room. Simultaneously, the retail landscape in Canada was undergoing a brutal transformation. The specialized independent hi-fi dealers that had built the NAD brand were losing ground to big-box electronics retailers like Future Shop. These massive warehouses thrived on high-volume inventory, aggressively advertised price cuts, and feature-heavy spec sheets. On a warehouse shelf stacked 30 units high, the minimalist design of an analog stereo amplifier looked less like engineering purity and more like an outdated antique. This dual pressure, the rise of home theater and the shift toward big-box retail pricing, created an existential crisis for NAD's European parent company. The original formula of the 3020 relied on low-cost manufacturing in Taiwan combined with brilliant European circuit design. But as the 1990s progressed, the economics of global manufacturing shifted. The cost of labor, parts, shipping, and domestic distribution was rising sharply, building a heavy, high-current amplifier with massive internal copper transformers was becoming significantly more expensive than mass-producing a lightweight digital receiver filled with cheap integrated circuits. To compete in the home theater arms race, NAD was forced to divert its limited capital away from refining two-channel stereo amplifiers and plunge into the brutally expensive world of digital video licensing and surround sound chip integration. It was a game they were ill-equipped to win. They were an audio company, not a computer company. By the late 1990s, the financial strain on the global brand was becoming unsustainable. The company that had sold over 1 million units of the most famous amplifier in history was bleeding capital. Product cycles slowed. Engineering teams were stretched dangerously thin. The gray boxes that had once defined the Canadian listening room were slowly being disconnected and moved to the basement, replaced by massive, complicated receivers that sounded thinner but offered the illusion of cinema. The brand was quietly fracturing. The original through-hole circuit boards had long ceased production, and the company behind them was staring at financial ruin. It seemed inevitable that the badge would be bought by a global holding company, slapped onto a cheap home theater in a box, and sold off as a hollow memory. But the Canadian distribution network that had made the 3020 a household name refused to let the system collapse. The executives at Lenbrook, watching their foundational brand edge toward the abyss, realized that distributing the product was no longer enough. If the honest Watt was going to survive the digital era, they would have to own it. In 1999, the financial exhaustion of NAD's international ownership reached a critical breaking point. The European parent company, battered by the brutal economics of the home theater transition and the rising costs of global manufacturing, was actively seeking a buyer. In the late 90s, when a legacy audio brand faltered, the standard industry outcome was highly predictable. A multinational holding company would purchase the name, fire the original acoustic engineers, close the dedicated testing labs, and slap the respected badge onto low-quality, mass-produced electronics. The Canadian audio market had already watched several iconic domestic names suffer this exact fate of brand dilution. The NAD badge, built on the uncompromising integrity of the 3020 amplifier, was dangerously close to becoming just another generic logo on a cheap plastic soundbar. But the executives at Lenbrook in Pickering, Ontario, understood the catastrophic loss this would represent. They were not merely a distribution company moving boxes, they were deeply embedded in the Canadian hi-fi ecosystem. They already owned PSB Speakers, a legendary Canadian loudspeaker brand deeply rooted in the National Research Council's measurement culture. They knew that if NAD fell to a corporate liquidator, the perfect electronic partner for their laboratory-tested speakers would be destroyed. In a historic inversion of the usual global ownership narrative, the Canadian distributor bought the global brand. Lenbrook acquired NAD entirely, absorbing its intellectual property, securing its engineering talent, and bringing the headquarters of the famous European-designed, Asian-manufactured amplifier brand directly to Ontario. This 1999 acquisition prevented the fragmentation of the company. It ensured that the engineers who understood the philosophy of high current power and dynamic headroom remained in control of the circuit boards. But while Canadian ownership saved the brand from immediate liquidation, it could not stop the tectonic shifts happening in the living rooms of North America. To survive the 2000s, the new Canadian ownership had to adapt to the very forces that had nearly bankrupted the company. NAD was forced to engineer AV receivers, complex audio-video control units that decoded surround formats and managed multiple channels. Yet, even in this new digital space, they attempted to enforce the ethos of the 3020. While competitors were aggressively advertising AV receivers with inflated claims of 100 watts per channel, Lenbrook introduced a measurement standard they called full disclosure power. They insisted on rating their home theater amplifiers with all channels driven simultaneously across the entire frequency range into difficult electrical loads, It was the honest watt philosophy applied to the surround sound era. A 50-watt Canadian-owned receiver would routinely outperform a heavily marketed 100-watt competitor when actually wired to a demanding set of speakers in a basement rec room. But the act of survival required a fundamental compromise. The sheer physical footprint of a home theater receiver, packed with video switching boards, digital to analog converters, and 5 separate channels of amplification, meant that the elegant mechanical minimalism of the original 1978 amplifier was lost. The gray box was replaced by massive, heat-generating black chassis. Then came the next technological wave, one that would permanently alter the physical nature of high fidelity. By the 2000s, physical media was collapsing. The compact disc player, a machine that reads a digital disc and turns it into music, was being rapidly replaced by the streamer, a network audio device that receives music from online services or local digital files. Furthermore, the very mechanics of amplification were changing. The industry was aggressively shifting toward Class D amplification, a highly efficient circuit design that uses rapid electronic switching to generate power with very little heat, completely eliminating the need for the massive, heavy copper transformers that had defined the weight and authority of the NAD 3020. For a company whose entire foundational myth was built on a heavy analog power supply driving a pair of wired stereo speakers, this software-driven wireless era presented a terrifying reality. To survive, the Canadian ownership could not simply rely on nostalgia. They had to transition the company from a mechanical hardware manufacturer into a digital software platform. Lenbrook poured its resources into developing Blue OS, a proprietary wireless streaming ecosystem designed to distribute high-resolution audio across multiple rooms. The strategy worked, but it meant the complete transformation of the brand's identity. The modern iteration of a budget NAD amplifier is no longer a purely analog machine. It is a highly integrated digital hub, packed with network cards, Bluetooth antennas, and software updates. It does not rely on a massive, heavy iron transformer to control a loudspeaker. It uses highly efficient digital switching modules. The market changed. The listening room was rewired. The heavy copper vanished. The physical switches disappeared. The analog era closed. The original through-hole circuit boards had long ceased production, leaving behind a market landscape where the badge survived by transforming its historical meaning. The NAD badge did not disappear into the silence of a corporate liquidation. Under the absolute stewardship of the Lenbrook Group, the brand survived by fundamentally changing its relationship with the listening room. Today, the operations in Pickering, Ontario, represent a massive digital audio ecosystem. Lenbrook successfully navigated the collapse of physical media, discs and tapes stored as objects, by pivoting hard into network streaming and software development. They eventually released a spiritual successor to their legendary machine, naming it the D3020. But the new version was a reflection of a vastly different world. It was a compact, vertically oriented amplifier designed to sit on a desktop next to a computer monitor. It utilized highly efficient Class D digital amplification, completely abandoning the massive, heavy copper power transformers of the past. It featured a built-in DAC, a digital-to-analog converter that turns digital data into an analog audio signal, and Bluetooth antennas. It was a brilliant piece of modern engineering, perfectly adapted to the software era. But out in the real world, across the Canadian landscape, the original, purely mechanical gray box refuses to become a static museum piece. On platforms like Canuck Audio Mart, Kijiji, and eBay, the original 1978 NAD 3020 remains one of the most fiercely hunted vintage audio components on the secondary market. It is not collected merely for nostalgia. It is actively sought out because it solves an acoustic problem that modern convenience audio has failed to address. Today, if a consumer wants to improve their television sound, they typically purchase a soundbar, a long, thin plastic enclosure packed with tiny, inexpensive drivers and digital processing chips. These devices are designed to be thrown away the moment their internal software becomes obsolete or their proprietary wireless connection fails. The 3020 represents the exact opposite philosophy. Across Canada, there is a thriving network of vintage audio repair benches, specialized technicians operating out of Montreal workshops, Toronto garages, and Vancouver storefronts. These technicians regularly receive old, dusty NAD 3020 amplifiers pulled from estate sales or thrift store shelves. When a technician opens the gray plastic lid today, they do not find a disposable, surface-mounted computer board. They find a highly serviceable, through-hole electronic landscape. The primary point of failure on a 40-year-old amplifier is the capacitors, the electronic components that store and release electrical energy for the power supply. Over decades, the chemical paste inside these capacitors dries out, causing the amplifier to lose its dynamic punch or develop a low electrical hum. This leads to a fascinating economic paradox, one that defines the true legacy of the machine. A vintage audio enthusiast will happily pay $200 to buy an old 3020 and then pay a technician another $300 for a complete recapping, the meticulous process of unsoldering and replacing every old capacitor on the board. They are deliberately spending more money to repair the amplifier than the machine cost when it was brand new in 1978. They do this because the physics of moving air have not changed. A repaired NAD 3020 wired to a high-quality pair of passive bookshelf speakers will still deliver a massive, high-current grip that completely obliterates the artificial, processed sound of a modern soundbar or a smart wireless speaker. The honest watt is not a nostalgic memory. It is a physical, measurable force that still dictates how well a woofer starts and stops. To buy a brand new modern amplifier with a comparable, heavy iron power supply capable of that same dynamic headroom, a listener would have to spend well over $1,000. The survival of the NAD 3020 proves what the Canadian Hi-Fi dealer network understood decades ago. When Lenbrook first distributed that ugly gray box to stereo shops in Ontario and Quebec, they were taking a massive gamble on the intelligence of the consumer. They bet that if a listener was forced to sit in a room, close their eyes, and actually listen to the physical impact of the music, they would choose truth over a polished aluminum faceplate. Lenbrook transformed from a distributor into a global audio empire because that bet paid off. They saved the brand from the home theater collapse because they understood that the foundational DNA of high-fidelity audio was worth protecting, even as the delivery method shifted from vinyl records to digital streams. The Canadian audio market has always possessed a unique relationship with the concept of proof. From the anechoic chambers of the National Research Council to the heavily carpeted floors of independent stereo shops, Canada was a proving ground for audio honesty. The 3020 became the ultimate expression of that culture. It was a European design, manufactured in Asia, but it was the Canadian distribution engine that realized its true potential and ultimately secured its global future. Somewhere in a damp Halifax basement, a small gray amplifier with a plastic volume knob clicks into life, its red LED glowing in the dark, driving a pair of worn fabric tweeters with the exact same honest current it promised nearly half a century ago. See you in the next one.